Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, April 1945. British soldiers push open the gates and stop dead in their tracks. Nothing in their military training prepared them for this. 60,000 living prisoners, barely alive. 25,000 corpses rotting in open pits. The smell hits them before they even enter. Within seconds, hardened combat veterans are weeping. Within weeks, the world will know what happened here. And within months, the people responsible will face a courtroom unlike any seen before in history. April 1945. The Second World War in Europe is in its final weeks. Allied forces are pushing deep into Germany from the west. Soviet forces are closing in from the east. The Nazi regime is collapsing. But inside Germany's concentration camps, the killing continues. Bergen-Belsen sits in a pine forest in northern Germany, near the town of Bergen in Lower Saxony. It was established in 1943, originally as a prisoner of war camp. Within 2 years, it had become something far more sinister. A dumping ground for thousands of prisoners evacuated from camps further east as Allied forces advanced. The camp was never equipped with gas chambers. The Nazis had a different method here. They simply stopped feeding people. No gas, no mass shootings, just deliberate, systematic starvation. Prisoners arrived already weakened from years of forced labor and abuse. At Bergen-Belsen, they were given almost nothing to eat, little water, and no medical care. Typhus swept through the overcrowded barracks. Dysentery followed. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. By the time British forces arrived on the 15th of April 1945, Bergen-Belsen had become a death camp, through neglect, a term that is deeply misleading. Because what happened there was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was policy. And the people who ran the camp knew exactly what they were doing. The question was whether they would ever be held accountable. The answer would come faster than anyone expected. And it would be broadcast to the entire world. To understand what happened at Bergen-Belsen, it helps to understand what it was designed to be, and how quickly that design collapsed into catastrophe. Bergen-Belsen was established in April 1943. Unlike Auschwitz or Treblinka, it was not initially built as an extermination camp. Its original purpose was to hold Jewish prisoners who might be exchanged for German nationals held by Allied powers or for foreign currency. These prisoners were kept in slightly better conditions than those in other camps, as the Nazis wanted them alive for potential negotiations. But by 1944, everything changed. As Soviet forces pushed westward, the Nazis began evacuating camps in Poland. Prisoners from Auschwitz, Mittelbau-Dora, and dozens of other camps were forced onto trains and marched hundreds of miles to camps further west. Bergen-Belsen became one of the primary destinations. The camp was never designed to hold these numbers. In mid-1944, Bergen-Belsen held around 7,000 prisoners. By February 1945, that number had exploded to 22,000. By April 1945, when British forces arrived, there were over 60,000 prisoners crammed into facilities built for a fraction of that number. Food supplies, already minimal, became nearly non-existent. Water systems collapsed. Sanitation failed completely. Prisoners slept on bare floors, packed so tightly they couldn't move. The dead lay alongside the living for days before anyone could remove them. Typhus spread rapidly in these conditions. So did typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and dysentery. Prisoners who arrived relatively healthy deteriorated within weeks. Many died within days of arrival. The camp commandant during this period was SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer. He had previously served at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he had overseen the operation of the gas chambers. At Bergen-Belsen, his approach was straightforward. Do the minimum required to maintain order, and let disease and starvation do the rest. Kramer made repeated requests to his superiors for more food and medicine. Whether these requests were genuine or performative remains debated by historians. What is clear is that even when small amounts of food were available, distribution was chaotic, and often deliberately withheld by guards who used food as a tool of control and punishment. The guards themselves were a mix of SS men and women, many of whom had transferred from other camps. Some were indifferent to the suffering around them. Others actively participated in it, beating prisoners, withholding food as punishment, selecting the weakest for the harshest conditions. Among them was a young woman named Irma Grese. She was 19 years old when she arrived at Bergen-Belsen. She had previously served at Auschwitz, where survivors described her as one of the most brutal guards in the camp. At Bergen-Belsen, she continued in the same manner, physically abusing prisoners, wielding her authority with casual cruelty. She was not alone. The camp staff included dozens of guards, male and female, who participated in the systematic abuse and neglect that killed thousands. By the time liberation came, approximately 25,000 prisoners had died at Bergen-Belsen. Thousands more would die in the weeks following liberation, their bodies too damaged by starvation and disease to recover, even with medical care. The evidence of what had happened was overwhelming, undeniable, and documented in real time by British military photographers and journalists who accompanied the liberating forces. The world saw the footage, and the world demanded answers. April 15, 1945. British forces from the 11th Armored Division approach Bergen-Belsen. They have been warned in advance, a rare negotiated handover arrangement meant to prevent the spread of typhus to surrounding areas. German forces had approached the British with an unusual request: accept the camp peacefully to avoid a disease outbreak. The British agreed, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found. Sergeant Norman Turgel was among the first soldiers to enter the camp. He later described the scene as something from another world. Bodies were stacked in piles throughout the camp grounds. Prisoners too weak to stand lay in the open, unable to move. The stench was overwhelming. Turgel and his fellow soldiers immediately began organizing relief efforts. Medical teams were called in. Food was distributed. Though doing so carefully, liberators quickly learned that giving starving prisoners too much food too quickly could be fatal, as their destroyed digestive systems couldn't process it. British Army chaplain Leslie Hardman entered the camp on the same day. He later wrote that he walked among the dead and the dying for hours, unable to fully comprehend what he was seeing. He conducted prayers over mass graves. He spoke to survivors who were too weak to lift their heads, but reached out to touch his hand. BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby broadcast one of the most significant radio reports in the history of journalism from Bergen-Belsen on the 19th of April, 1945. His broadcast was so disturbing that BBC executives initially refused to air it, believing the public wouldn't accept that human beings could do such things to one another. Dimbleby threatened to resign if the report wasn't broadcast. It aired the following day. His words reached millions of listeners across Britain and were picked up by news outlets worldwide. For many people, Dimbleby's report was the first confirmation that the rumors about Nazi concentration camps were not propaganda, but documented reality. The British military immediately secured the camp and began identifying the perpetrators. Josef Kramer was arrested on the day of liberation. He was found in his office, apparently unconcerned about the arrival of British forces. Photographs taken at the time of his arrest show a heavy-set man in SS uniform, looking almost bored. He would later be dubbed the Beast of Belsen by the British press, a nickname that followed him to his trial and execution. Other staff members were also detained. Some tried to flee. Others were identified by survivors who pointed them out to British soldiers. A number of guards were captured in the surrounding area in the days following liberation. The British moved quickly. Within weeks of liberation, they had assembled enough evidence to begin preparing criminal charges. The decision was made to conduct a military tribunal rather than wait for the broader Nuremberg process, which was still being organized. The Belsen trial, as it would come to be known, would begin in September 1945, just 5 months after liberation. It would be one of the first major Nazi war crimes trials of the post-war period, and it would result in some of the most significant verdicts in the history of international justice. September 17, 1945. A British military court convenes in the town of Lüneburg, Germany, just 30 miles from Bergen-Belsen. 45 defendants sit in the dock, men and women who served as guards and administrators at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. The trial is unprecedented in several ways. First, the speed. Most major war crimes trials took years to organize. The Belsen trial began just 5 months after liberation. The British military moved with unusual urgency, recognizing that the evidence was fresh, the witnesses were available, and the world was watching. Second, the defendants. Among the 45 accused were 16 women, a significant number that reflected the reality of how Bergen-Belsen operated. Female guards had participated in the abuse and neglect that killed thousands. Their inclusion in the trial sent a clear message. Gender was not a shield from accountability. Third, the charges. The defendants were charged under the laws of war for violations of the Geneva Convention. This legal framework was more straightforward than the crimes against humanity charges used at Nuremberg, but it carried the same potential penalties, including death. The chief defendant was Josef Kramer, the camp commandant. He was charged with violations of the laws and customs of war, specifically for the conditions at Bergen-Belsen and for his earlier role at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Kramer's defense was one that would become familiar in subsequent Nazi war crimes trials. He claimed he was following orders from his superiors. He argued that he had done everything possible to improve conditions at Bergen-Belsen given the resources available. He portrayed himself as an administrator overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. The prosecution dismantled this defense systematically. Survivor testimony was central to the prosecution's case. Men and women who had survived Bergen-Belsen took the stand and described in precise detail what they had witnessed and experienced. They identified specific guards. They described specific incidents of violence. They provided dates, locations, and details that corroborated documentary evidence. One survivor described watching a guard beat a prisoner to death with a wooden club for attempting to pick up a piece of bread from the ground. Another described being forced to carry corpses while guards watched and laughed. A third described the systematic withholding of water from prisoners who were already dying of dehydration. The testimony of medical professionals who had entered the camp at liberation was equally powerful. British Army doctors described the physical condition of survivors in clinical terms: advanced starvation, organ failure, untreated infections, severe psychological trauma. Their testimony made clear that these conditions were not the result of wartime shortages, but of deliberate policy. Among the most closely watched defendants was Irma Grese. Grese was 21 years old at the time of the trial. She had joined the SS Auxiliary at 18, served at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, before arriving at Bergen-Belsen. Survivors described her as one of the most feared guards at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. A woman who beat prisoners with a plaited leather whip, who set her trained dogs on prisoners, who selected prisoners for the gas chambers at Auschwitz. At trial, Grese showed little emotion. She denied the most serious allegations against her, but admitted to hitting prisoners. She claimed her actions were necessary to maintain order. The court was unmoved. Another prominent defendant was Franz Hessler, an SS officer who had served at multiple camps, including Auschwitz, where he had overseen the selection of prisoners for the gas chambers. At Bergen-Belsen, he had continued in a supervisory role. Also among the defendants was Juana Bormann, a 52-year-old female guard known to survivors as the woman with the dogs. She had trained her Alsatian dog to attack prisoners on command, and had used this method to torture and kill numerous individuals. The trial lasted 54 days. Hundreds of witnesses testified. Thousands of documents were entered into evidence. On the 17th of November, 1945, the verdicts were delivered. 30 of the 45 defendants were found guilty. 14 were acquitted. 1 defendant died during the proceedings. 11 defendants received death sentences. Josef Kramer, Irma Grese, Fritz Klein, Peter Weingartner, Franz Hessler, Juana Bormann, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Karl Francio, Heinrich Schrerer, Erich Zodl, and Johann Heuskel. The remaining convicted defendants received prison sentences ranging from 1 year to life imprisonment. The verdicts were delivered. The sentences were confirmed. And on the 13th of December 1945, justice arrived at Hameln Prison. Hameln Prison, the 13th of December 1945. It is a cold winter morning in northern Germany. Inside the prison, 11 convicted Nazi war criminals await execution. Among them is the commandant of Bergen-Belsen, the most feared female guard in the camp's history, and 9 others whose actions contributed directly to the deaths of 25,000 people. The executions are carried out by Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner. Pierrepoint is considered the most skilled hangman of his era, a man who approached his work with professional precision and spoke little about it publicly. On this single morning, he will carry out 11 executions. Josef Kramer is among the first to be executed. He walks to the gallows without apparent emotion, the same detached demeanor he displayed throughout his trial. He makes no final statement. He shows no remorse. Within seconds, it is over. Irma Grese follows. At 22 years old, Irma Grese becomes one of the youngest women executed under British jurisdiction in the 20th century. Her final word, spoken as the trapdoor opens, is reported to have been schnell, the German word for quickly. Whether this was a final act of defiance or simply an involuntary utterance remains unknown. What is known is that the woman survivors, described as the hyena of Auschwitz, died that morning at Hameln Prison, having been held fully accountable for her crimes. Juana Bormann, the woman with the dogs, is also executed that morning. She is 52 years old. Unlike Grese, she reportedly breaks down in the hours before her execution, expressing fear but not remorse. Franz Hessler, Fritz Klein, Peter Weingartner, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and the remaining condemned are executed in sequence throughout the morning. Pierrepoint later noted that the entire process was completed with efficiency and without incident. The executions at Hameln on the 13th of December 1945 represented one of the most significant acts of post-war justice in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. They demonstrated that the Allied powers were serious about accountability, that rank and gender were irrelevant to culpability, and that the crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen would not go unpunished. But they also raised questions that would persist for decades. 30 defendants had been convicted, 11 were executed. The remaining 19 received prison sentences, but how long would those sentences actually be served? Would the guards and administrators who had participated in the deaths of 25,000 people spend the rest of their lives in prison? The answer, for many of them, was no. And that answer would become one of the most controversial aspects of post-war justice in Germany. The Belsen trial was fast. It was decisive. And, by the standards of post-war military justice, it was remarkably thorough. But it was also incomplete. Of the 45 defendants tried, only 11 were executed. 19 received prison sentences. But prison sentences in post-war Germany were subject to review, reduction, and early release, in ways that many survivors found deeply unjust. Several convicted guards were released within a few years of their sentencing. By the early 1950s, with West Germany seeking reintegration into the Western Alliance and Cold War priorities dominating political thinking, pressure grew to release remaining war criminals held in Allied prisons. The Landsberg prison releases of 1,951 and 1,952, authorized by American High Commissioner John J. McCloy, saw dozens of convicted war criminals released early. While the Belsen defendants were held in British custody rather than American, the political atmosphere was similar. There was growing pressure across Western Germany to move on, to reintegrate former Nazis into civilian society, and to treat the war as a closed chapter. For survivors of Bergen-Belsen, this was a profound betrayal. Many of the 60,000 prisoners liberated from Bergen-Belsen had nowhere to go. Their homes had been seized. Their families had been murdered. Their communities had been destroyed. They spent years in displaced persons camps, stateless and traumatized, while some of the people responsible for their suffering were quietly released and returned to normal life in Germany. But the story doesn't end with the Belsen trial. Beyond the 45 defendants tried in Lüneburg, hundreds of other Bergen-Belsen staff members were never prosecuted. The chaos of the immediate post-war period, the sheer number of potential defendants across all the Nazi camps, and the limited resources of Allied prosecutors meant that the majority of perpetrators faced no legal consequences whatsoever. Some returned to German society seamlessly. A former guard might move to a new town, use a slightly different name, and resume civilian life. Without a centralized system for tracking and prosecuting former concentration camp personnel, many slipped through entirely. It wasn't until the 1960s that German prosecutors began a more systematic effort to identify and prosecute former camp staff. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 were a significant step. 22 former Auschwitz personnel were tried, with most receiving prison sentences. But Bergen-Belsen received far less attention in subsequent prosecutions. One significant case emerged decades later. In 2015, the prosecution of Oskar Groening, the so-called bookkeeper of Auschwitz, established a crucial legal precedent. Groening was convicted not for committing specific acts of violence, but for being part of the machinery of murder, for facilitating the operation of a death camp through his administrative role. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison at the age of 94. This precedent opened the door for similar prosecutions of former Bergen-Belsen personnel. German prosecutors began reviewing cases of former camp staff who were still alive, most of whom were in their 90s or older. In 2021, a 95-year-old former secretary at the Stutthof concentration camp was convicted of accessory to murder in more than 10,000 cases. Her case, and others like it, drew directly on the Groening precedent. For Bergen-Belsen specifically, investigations continued into the 2020s, though the advanced age of any remaining living perpetrators made prosecutions increasingly difficult. The question of whether these late prosecutions constitute meaningful justice remains deeply contested. But the survivors and their descendants argue that the legal principle matters, that no one who participated in these crimes should die, having been officially declared innocent. Bergen-Belsen today is a memorial site. The barracks are gone burned by the British military shortly after liberation to stop the spread of typhus. What remains are open fields, mass graves marked by simple mounds of earth, and a documentation center that tells the story of what happened there. Visitors walk the grounds in silence. The scale of the site is striking, acre after acre of carefully maintained grass covering the graves of 25,000 people. Stone markers indicate mass graves containing hundreds of victims each. One reads, "Here rest 5,000 dead, April 1945. The memorial receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. School groups from across Germany and Europe come to learn what happened here. Survivors and their descendants make pilgrimages to honor the dead. But memorialization, however important, is not the same as justice. The Belsen trial of 1945 represented a particular form of justice, of what legal scholars call retributive justice, the principle that those who commit wrongs deserve punishment proportional to their crimes. 11 people were executed. 19 received prison sentences. The verdict was clear. What happened at Bergen-Belsen was criminal, and those responsible would be punished. But retributive justice has limits. It can punish individuals, but it cannot undo harm. It can execute a camp commandant, but it cannot restore the lives of 25,000 people who died of starvation and disease. It can imprison a guard, but it cannot give back the years stolen from survivors who spent decades dealing with the physical and psychological consequences of their imprisonment. The survivors of Bergen-Belsen, who lived long enough to see the Belsen trial, had complicated feelings about the verdicts. Many felt that execution was the appropriate punishment for the most serious offenders. Others felt that no punishment could be proportional to the scale of what had been done. Some expressed relief. Others felt nothing too damaged by their experiences to find comfort in legal proceedings. Anne Frank died at Bergen-Belsen in February or March of 1945, just weeks before liberation. She was 15 years old. Her diary, published after the war by her father Otto, the only member of the Frank family to survive, became one of the most widely read accounts of the Holocaust. Her story gave a human face to the abstract numbers of Bergen-Belsen's death toll. Josef Kramer, the man ultimately responsible for the conditions that killed Anne Frank and 25,000 others, was executed in December 1945. Whether that constitutes justice for Anne Frank's death is a question that has no clean answer. What the Belsen trial did accomplish was establishing precedent. It demonstrated that concentration camp personnel at every level, commandants, guards, administrators, could be held criminally liable for their roles in the system. It established that following orders was not an absolute defense. It showed that female perpetrators would be held to the same standard as male ones. These precedents fed directly into the Nuremberg trials, which were already underway when the Belsen verdicts were delivered. They informed the development of international humanitarian law throughout the second half of the 20th century. They shaped the legal frameworks used to prosecute war criminals in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and Sierra Leone decades later. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002, draws directly on the legal principles first articulated at the Nuremberg and Belsen trials. The idea that individuals can be held criminally responsible for crimes against humanity, regardless of their official position or the orders they were given, is now a cornerstone of international law. That principle was tested and proven at Lüneburg in 1945. In recent years, Germany has continued to pursue accountability for Nazi-era crimes with renewed intensity. The 2011 conviction of John Demjanjuk as an accessory to murder at the Sobibor death camp, despite the absence of evidence linking him to specific individual killings, expanded the legal basis for prosecution. The 2015 Groningen conviction went further still, and subsequent cases involving former personnel at Stutthof, Sachsenhausen, and other camps have maintained the principle that time does not erase criminal responsibility. For the families of the 25,000 who died at Bergen-Belsen, these prosecutions, however late, however incomplete, matter. They represent an official acknowledgement by the German state that what happened was criminal, that the victims were not statistics, but human beings whose deaths demand accounting. The executions at Hameln Prison on the 13th of December 1945 were the beginning of that accounting. They were not the end, because justice for Bergen-Belsen is not a single verdict or a single execution. It is an ongoing commitment to remember, to document, to prosecute where possible, and to ensure that the systems and ideologies that made Bergen-Belsen possible are never allowed to take hold again. 25,000 people died in a pine forest in northern Germany because a regime decided their lives had no value. 11 people were executed for those deaths. Dozens more were imprisoned. Hundreds escaped accountability entirely. Whether that constitutes justice is for history to decide. But the world saw what happened at Bergen-Belsen. The world heard Richard Dimbleby's broadcast. The world watched the Belsen trial. The world witnessed the executions. And the world has been arguing about whether it was enough ever since.